Okay, so thank you for being here again. This is my second lecture for the weekend at SNPI 2025, and it's really a continuation of where I left off, so I'm going to jump right into that. For those that didn't see me yesterday, I will say that my name is Robert Schoch. I'm a Boston University faculty member, and I have been since 1984, and my PhD is in geology and geophysics from Yale University, and I first got involved looking at ancient civilizations, incredibly ancient civilizations, back in 1990 with my first trip to Egypt with John Anthony West. So where I left off yesterday was the concept that there was civilization, what I refer to specifically as civilization. I'll make the case more for that in just a few minutes, in Egypt, in Turkey, probably elsewhere. And I say probably because the evidence is not yet as definitive beyond Turkey and Egypt, although we're getting lots of evidence now that this is a worldwide phenomenon, that we had a cycle of civilization before the end of the last ice age. I call it a cycle of civilization that was decimated at the end of the last ice age with the natural catastrophes at that time caused, and you will hear about this more in a few minutes, caused by the sun, caused by a major solar outburst. So where I left off with was Göbekli Tepe and Turkey, and this is a site that is still under excavation, although much of it now is being used, or should we say parts of it have been really beautifully preserved so that people can come and see it, humanity can come and see it. Other parts are continuing to be excavated. It was first seriously excavated by the late professor Dr. Klaus Schmidt in 1995. Unfortunately, he passed away. And it's really an incredible site. And I showed you pictures of that yesterday. It, as I mentioned yesterday, is situated in northern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates and what is now modern southeastern Turkey. And this is the area that some people consider the biblical Eden. If you read the Old Testament, Genesis, and the description of Eden, it mentions this Tigris and Euphrates. So I'm not saying the Garden of Eden, and I'm not even claiming Eden myself, but many people have pointed this out. In fact, Klaus Schmidt pointed that out. And I also mentioned how in the city of Urfa, or Şanlıurfa, when they excavate down, they often find the strata, the archaeological sites from Göbekli Tepe time, about 12,000 years ago. One of them is this beautiful statue that was found very near the pools of Abraham in Urfa, and has become known colloquially as Urfa Man. We had a chance to discuss things with the late Klaus Schmidt, and I just didn't expect him to die prematurely. And I went there skeptical about the dating of it, because I'm always skeptical about everything, even if it confirms my own work. And no, he assured me, and I've read all the literature and looked at the strata myself. Yes, it goes back to the 10th millennium BCE. It goes back to the end of the last ice age. As I mentioned yesterday, the pillars are ornately carved. They're beautiful. Some of them are anthropomorphic with arms and hands and belts. I'll get more into that in a few minutes. And the entire site was intentionally buried. And that is something I'm going to focus on today, why it was intentionally buried at the end of the last ice age. I do want to point out, and I showed the pictures along the bottom yesterday, but I want to point out that something that is found, and I find it as a geologist equally sophisticated to the incredible pillars in the large megalithic structures, are these little beads and other little artifacts that are found. So in the middle and left side, that's my hand holding a little bead, and as I mentioned yesterday, it is drilled through. This is a stone bead, very hard stone bead, drilled through. How do you do that if you don't have metal, if you don't have precise tools. And I have been thinking about this, and I've been reading metallurgical reports and discussing this with colleagues, and I am coming more and more to the conclusion that we have to realistically consider the possibility that they had metal, and specifically iron, wrought iron. I don't know if you know much about iron and metallurgy. I've been learning about. You can make wrought iron or mold wrought iron from hematite and other iron-rich metals without bringing it to a full melt. You can bring it, you can soften it, you can beat out the impurities, and you can make wrought iron. Not cast iron, but wrought iron. And wrought iron tools, even small tools, they would be incredibly useful. And I think we have to start thinking about whether they might have had these. In fact, something that archaeologists have noted is that tens of thousands of years ago, before the end of the last ice age, there were apparently ancient people mining extensively what we would consider iron ore, and the usual archaeological explanation is that they were using this as pigment, red pigment, which sure, they could use that as, but why did they need so much pigment? That's a real mystery. But if they were using some of it to make wrought iron, even small tools, that would be amazing, actually, according to the dogma. And the thing is, what would you find after all these millennia? I've got a fly that wants to visit me. All these millennia, what would you find? You wouldn't find the tools anymore. You would find little lines of rust in the sand. Am I making sense? And if you're not looking for that, are you going to find it? No, I would contend. And even if you're looking for it, and I'm speaking now as a geologist, it would be so ephemeral. It would be so indistinct compared to the background dust and whatnot when you're brushing things away. In fact, if you're using, you know how you see archaeologists using their little brush to brush things away, they would brush that away immediately. If you had, say, an iron pin or iron drill, that type of thing. So again, not definitive proof yet until we find it, but we better start looking, is my feeling, and we may find something quite exceptional, at least according to the standard paradigm. So why do I say that Göbekli Tepe represents true civilization? Three major distinguishing characteristics that my academic colleagues use to distinguish civilization in the archaeological record. Monumental stone architecture. Do we have that? Yes, I showed that to you yesterday. Settled urban or city life. One of the arguments has been that, well, they weren't settled. Göbekli Tepe was just a site they all came to for a short period of time. Yeah, right, and built those monuments. And then left again. They weren't settled. And also they say, they weren't literate, because civilization implies literacy. It implies historical records. So these are the things that are used by the standard paradigm, and I would contend that the Göbekli Tepe people, and I'll use that term generally because we don't know what they call themselves, have all three of them. They certainly have monumental structures. They had cities, I have no doubt. I think that Şanlıurfa is probably a city that was continuously inhabited for at least the past 12,000 years. It's sometimes known as the city of prophets. It was very important in classical ancient times and medieval times. It was a former Odessa. So I think those two, I have no doubt about, and I actually have no doubt about the third one. Did they have writing? And this is one of the pillars. This is pillar 18, and enclosure D. And Dr. Manu Safzadeh and I have looked at this and published on this, and we suggest that the first known word, world's first known written word at Göbekli Tepe, T-shaped pillar 18 means God. Bottom line is, this pillar and some of the other pillars, they have these symbols. They have, in this case, a belt on the pillar. we contend, we hypothesize that these are not just pretty symbols, it's not just random patterns, but in fact it is writing. And I would contend that if you found this in an archaeological site that was 10,000 years later or 8,000 years later, more or less, say 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, or up to the Common Era, people would say, well, we can't interpret it, but they would not doubt it was written language. But because it's 12,000 years old, they don't want to admit that. But when you compare, for instance, the symbols at Göbekli Tepe and what is known as Luwian or Hittite hieroglyphics or Anatolian hieroglyphics, which are fairly well understood, fairly well known. Yes, they are thousands and thousands of years later, but there seems to be, we're convinced, a continuity and a similarity. So, for instance, this symbol, and these are known as La Roche symbols. You see in the upper left there, the title page of La Roche's work on what he called the Hittite hieroglyphs. These are fairly well known. The symbol you see on the bottom right, that symbol, that drawing, do you see how it's very similar to what's on Göbekli Tepe? Yeah, it's not exactly the same, but I wouldn't expect it to be exactly the same thousands and thousands of years later. But when you start looking at where known the La Roche or Hittite symbols or Anatolian symbols, we have very similar to what you have in some cases on Göbekli Tepe. So we have H shapes. H sort of looks like the modern H letter, which basically translates as a portal or a passageway or a gate. We have 184. You see that? It looks like a little sun and a moon. That's referring to the divine. We have the symbol, La Roche symbol 360, which means God, and 411, connection to God, looks like a C shape. And then when you start looking at something like this, here's the belt on one side of the pillar, and my reading of this would be, this is my personal reading now, tentative, is that this literally says, reading from right to left, God of gods, that this is representing sort of a God-type figure or overarching omnipotent God. Here's another one that's right out of La Roche or the Hittite later, 10,000, 8,000 years later, passageway to the divine. Yeah, 8,000 years later from 10,000 BC would be about, did I get that right? 2,000 BCE. So somewhere around there. Or if you look at this one, here's another one. Do you see that on the Göbekli Tepe pillar? And how similar it is to the symbols? And I could show you numerous examples, but bottom line is that we are hypothesizing that yes, they were literate. They did have a form of writing, so they fulfill all the requirements. As a side note, I'm going to be talking about plasma and plasma configurations. These may originate from plasma configurations, so just keep that thought in mind. We have other signs of incredible sophistication at Göbekli Tepe. So this is Göbekli Tepe. That's an early photograph that Katie took about 2010 or so. And in the upper right, that is a map. A map of Göbekli Tepe that was put together by Peters and Schmidt. And I'm using it here to show you the stone enclosures or the stone circles. And remember that when you look down, this is an aerial view of Göbekli Tepe. This is a photograph that Katie took of a photograph in the museum. We didn't get to fly over Göbekli Tepe directly, although it'd be great to do that in a balloon maybe. But I'm using this diagram from Peters and Schmidt, and I have drawn in those black lines. Do you see those black lines? That's me. And what that is showing is the orientation of the central pillars. Do you see how there's pairs of central pillars? And some of them are anthropomorphic. They face to the south and slightly east. But do you see how they don't all face in the same direction? Everyone see that? Yeah. So what is happening here, by my analysis, what is happening is that they are looking out toward the Pleiades, Taurus, and Orion on the vernal equinox. but the vernal equinox and the constellations in the sky, the relative positions to each other, change over time due to precession. Everyone knows about precession, or you've heard of precession and the precessional ages, Aries, Pisces, Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, etc. And interestingly, and I think really significantly, when I did crude analysis of when they had these precessional changes, so they're changing slightly from enclosure D at the top to C to B to A, that is the same order as we would determine independently based on the geology and the strata, and you can look at like which are above other stratigraphically. Am I making sense? So you get the same analysis. So I'm very convinced that they were aware of precession. They were rebuilding or building new structures, basically going down the hill, if you would. If you go there, you'll see that. And they were following precessional changes in the sky, looking out at Orion and Taurus and Pleiades. And I'm sure you're aware that Orion is that one of the oldest constellations that we know has been identified. Goes back tens of thousands of years. I was talking to some people about this earlier today, and I'm convinced that this is Göbekli Tepe. This is standing at the top of the Göbekli Tepe, looking toward the south and slightly east, looking toward modern Syria. And this is what they would have seen rising on the vernal equinox, Orion, Taurus, and Pleiades. And just to elaborate on this a little bit, look at pillar 18, that famous pillar where I think it says God of gods, etc. It's also, in many ways, I would contend, essentially you could view it as a rendition of Orion in stone. It's got the belt, it's got the loincloth that ties in with what you see on Orion. The arms are there, but they've been brought down. Plus, there's a little animal there. Do you see that little doggish type animal? What was the dog star and Sirius? All ties together, I think, as possibilities. And one possibility, I just want to mention this because I think it's appropriate to this conference at SNPI, is that Walter Crittenden, some of you may have heard of him, he does a conference on precession and ancient knowledge, and he personally and some of his colleagues have suggested that precession may not be a wobble of the Earth's axis, but actually may be because we are part of a binary system. Our sun may have a companion, and as our sun and this companion go around their center of gravity, basically, that would account for the precessional ages, the changes in what we see in the sky over 24 to 26,000 year period. It varies a little bit over time. And who is that companion? It could be a dark star. It could be some kind of, dark mass that we can't see. It's also been suggested it may be Sirius. It may be Sirius. Did the ancients, were they somehow maybe aware of this, of Orion and Sirius in the sky? Is that being represented by these double pillars where you have one maybe being Orion and another representing Sirius or a sun? Again, I throw these out as hypotheses for you to think about. Either way, what I'm finding at Göbekli Tepe is incredible sophistication. So let's move on. What could wipe out such advanced civilizations? As I mentioned yesterday, we have evidence of catastrophe at Göbekli Tepe. We have pillars that were knocked down and broken and then re-erected. Sometimes people go there and they think, oh, that's the archaeologists who re-erected those pillars. No, that's how it was found. And these crude walls, do you see the crude walls up against the pillars? Those are secondary walls, but they are ancient. And there's been radiocarbon dating done on them and isotope analysis done on various minerals associated with them that places those crude walls and the re-erection, if you would, right at the end of the last ice age, 9700 BCE. Just to give you another view of this, and you saw this yesterday if you were here, there you see how it's that pillar, look at that pillar on the right side, how it was put into position, and then the entire site was covered over intentionally. Now, if you go on the internet, you really realize you should not trust everything on the internet, correct? And I guess this video will probably be on the internet too, but don't trust everything on the internet. There's been a lot of discussion recently, Göbekli Tepe wasn't actually intentionally buried. I am telling you that my analysis personally, as well as that of other people like Klaus Schmidt, was that it was intentionally buried. You can look at the strata and other sites now that have been found. The one that is very prominent is Karahan Tepe. And if you look at the archaeological reports, and I've visited personally also, it too was intentionally buried at this time. So intentional burial, I am convinced as a geologist and stratigrapher, is absolutely real. So the question is, why would they do this? And this brings us to when they were doing it, which is the end of the last ice age. The end of the last ice age, and a lot of people get confused about this, including people who are, should not be confused about this because ostensibly they've been studying it. The end of the last ice age is what's known as the Younger Dryas, or I should put it this way, the last 1,200 years of the end of the last ice age is the Younger Dryas. So the ice age was beginning to warm up. Things were beginning to warm up until 10,900 BCE, when all of a sudden there was a cold snap again. And I say all of a sudden as a geologist. And so there's a 1,200-year period of cooler temperatures again. That is known as the Younger Dryas. It's known as the Younger Dryas because the Dryas is actually a little alpine flower that flourishes in colder weather, and you find a lot of pollen from it. So that's why it's called the Younger Dryas. And then there's a final and incredibly sudden warming in 9700 BCE. So if you look at this, and I can't see it from here, I can see it on the computer screen. If you look at the chart, you see we're coming out of the east left. And then we were getting warmer. The Earth was getting warmer. Then there's a cold snap. That's the Younger Dryas. Here, I'll try to walk over here. That's the Younger Dryas, shown diagrammatically. And then an incredible warming spell, virtually overnight, and I'll demonstrate that to you in a second. That is coming out of the last ice age. So the end of the last ice age is here at 9700 BCE. If you've heard about and I'll mention comets a second again. Some people say a comet ended the ice age. Not at all. Even if you, quote, believe in comets or accept the comet theory, that's 10,900 BCE, not 9,700 BCE. Everyone with me at the moment? When I was a graduate student, don't try to read all this. This is simply put up there to show you their science. When I was a graduate student, I was very interested in the end of the last ice age. It just turns out we were thinking it ended very suddenly. We were thinking in terms of, a couple of centuries. That's really sudden geologically, and that was almost, heretical to even think that. Then this paper came out in 2008 suggesting it could have happened in only a few years. In fact, I think they say that could happen in a few years. And this was based on ice core data from Greenland. Then this paper came out, and I show you just one example of the type of research being done. This came out in 2014. What you're looking at is going from the right side to the left side. So right to left, you're getting older to younger. But what we're seeing here is these are year markers. This is an ice cores. This is literally the last 3 years of the Ice Age. This is the first year of what's known as the Holocene or post-Ice Age. So also this is the last 3 years of the Younger Dryas, which is last year, 3 years of the Ice Age. And based on isotope changes, this is the end of the last Ice Age right there. It's not taking several years. It's not taking a full year. It's literally overnight as far as we can determine it. What causes that? And my answer, which I'll develop further, but most of I think a major solar outburst. So it's not a comet. So just to summarize here, we have final cold snap. A lot of people like the comet theory. Why? Because a comet or asteroid, a bolide impactor, would throw up all kinds of dust, they would say, and that would cause a cooling spell. Does that make sense? Yeah, just because it makes sense doesn't mean it's right, correct? No, I'm serious. And do we have in the geological record potentially aspects or incidents of major impactors causing essentially they used to call it nuclear winter or cooling spell? Yes, we do. But that doesn't mean that's what happened at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And I'll get to why the sun could cause the beginning of the Younger Dryas shortly. So I don't think it's an impactor at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, but be that as it may, I'm not even that interested in the beginning. My real focus personally has been the end of the Younger Dryas, the end of the last ice age. Just as a side note, because you may have heard about this some years ago now, 2018, relatively recent crater was found in Greenland. And the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, people say, oh, here's the crater, proves it was a comet that hit and began the Younger Dryas. And I was very skeptical reading the original reports and the data. Then this just shows you how science works. Then 4 years later, in 2022, good dating was established for that crater. Guess what? It's tens of millions of years old. Has nothing to do with that last ice age. So I just give you this example, not to sound the wrong way. But if not a comet, then what is happening? This is another, there's been a lot of work on the comet back and forth and a lot of discussion, which seems to be dying down now. I do want to mention, and I'll mention this again, that yes, there is good evidence that something happened during the Younger Dryas, both at the beginning and the end of the Younger Dryas, and there are all kinds of proxies and evidence like fused spherules and vitrified glass, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out, in my assessment, and I'll make the case here as I go on, all of that data that actually is good data, shocked quartz, et cetera, can be caused by plasma. Plasma discharges from the sun. You don't need to necessarily have an impactor. So I think it has to do with the sun. And the sun, our sun is what? It's a star. We have a star, just like other planets and other solar type systems have stars, and our star is a fairly regular star in its class. It's not always stable. It's not always quiet. Sometimes it's stable, and most people like to think of it that way because it's very scary otherwise, but it can undergo major solar outbursts. And that's what happened, I'm convinced, as I'll make the case to you in the next half hour. That's what happened at the end of the last ice age. Sometimes it's quiet, and sometimes it can undergo outbursts. It can eject plasma, discharges, what are known as coronal mass ejections, what are known as solar particle or solar proton events. Why protons? Because the sun is primarily what? Hydrogen. And, secondarily, helium. All elements are in there in small amounts, but mostly hydrogen. And these plasma outbursts, if they hit Earth, can cause incredible destruction. You can think of huge lightning bolts under the worst case scenario hitting Earth. In the worst case scenario, from our human perspective, and I'm convinced at the end of the last ice, and this could cause what we see. It could cause instantaneous warming, essentially instantaneous melting of the glaciers, rising of sea levels. Something that's everyone's. Is this sound working?
Yeah, it's choke up a little bit on it.
What's happening?
Blocking the antenna.
Oh, the antenna's down there. I didn't realize that. Sorry, antenna. I'm working with electromagnetics here. Yes. So anyway, what was I saying? Oh, yeah. Flood legends, do they occur around the world?
They hear you.
Yeah, and what you get with a solar outburst and incredible warming incredibly quickly, as I showed you in that slide, is you're going to get evaporation of lakes and oceans, especially if you have plasma. Think of huge lightning bolts hitting it. All that water moisture goes into the atmosphere. You're melting glaciers virtually instantaneous. You're putting more moisture in the atmosphere. The atmosphere can only hold so much moisture, and what happens? Incredible rains, incredible flooding on land. At the same time, you're melting glaciers, you've got rising sea levels, etc. It's even been in the news recently, these incredible floods that we're experiencing with very, very, compared to the end of the last ice age, very, very minor climatic changes, minor global warming, if you want to call it that, but minor climatic changes. So it was much worse at the end of the last ice age. Not to sound the wrong way, but if you're not used to thinking about plasma as the fourth state of matter, what is plasma? It's basically, it used to be called ionized gas. It's basically a situation where you have charged particles. So think about the sun, because I'm focusing on the sun specifically. You've got a lot of hydrogen there, as well as helium and other elements. And in the heat of the sun and the movement, basically you separate the protons and the electrons. And in the case of the sun, when they're discharged, they're moving at incredible speeds. In some cases, good percentage of the speed of light. This is what we're talking about as plasma in this context. So plasma coming, and you have the solar wind all the time coming, interacting with our atmosphere. And it looks pretty. You have things like the aurora, so aurora borealis, the northern lights, or the southern lights, the aurora australis. And courtesy of NASA, here's a little diagram, not to scale, but you see how you've got the Earth not to scale and the sun and the solar winds. And it's interesting, what does that look like, the magnetic field, as it's distorted like a spider? Doesn't it look sort of like a spider? But when you have a major solar outburst, you would have plasma discharges coming down. Again, as I mentioned, like huge lightning bolts. That's probably what they would look like in certain cases. In other cases, you would see these incredible auroras in the sky that would take on definitive shapes. I'll get back to that. One of the first people to really talk about this to any extent was Thomas Gold. Unfortunately, he's now deceased, but he was a Gold prize winner. He won a number of prizes for his work in astrophysics. He was at Cornell University. And some people said that he was absolutely brilliant, but got a few things wrong. And I'll come to that. So, for instance, in the 1960s, this is a quote from him. In the case of a big, what he's referring to as a solar outburst, big solar outburst, the Earth's magnetic field could clearly not hold up the incoming gas. He called it gas, but we would now call it plasma, or the charged particles, and it would indeed drive down to the atmospheric level, and it would take, he said, the form of a series of sparks burning for extended periods of time and carrying currents of hundreds of millions of amperes. And he said, it would cause all kinds of effects, among other things, vitrified glass. Now, I was saying that some people in his lifetime said, oh, you're brilliant, but sometimes you make mistakes. This was one of the, quote, mistakes they thought he was making, because they said, no, the sun is very stable. It's never going to do anything like this whatsoever. He actually, and unfortunately it was pretty much ignored in his time early on, but he actually was involved with the Apollo missions to the moon. And he found evidence of this on the moon. Vitrified rock. What is vitrified rock? It's where it's been hit by really incredible temperatures. We're talking, thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands even, degrees centigrade. It melts the surface and then it recongeals as glass. That's a vitrification, a really sort of a crude glass. It's actually very fragile from a geological point of view. It will weather and erode very, very easily. On the moon, you don't have the same atmosphere, so it gets preserved much more easily. And he analyzed, as you see in this paper in 1969, some of the early data coming back from the Apollo missions to the moon. and he found vitrified rock. His entire abstract here is some glazing, that is, the vitrification is apparently due to radiation heating. Another way to say that is solar outbursts. It suggests a giant solar outburst in geologically recent times. Geologically recent times, I'm translating that from 1969, that's end of the last ice age. So there you had it. We find on Earth vitrified rock. This is in my beloved Egypt. This is known as the Libyan desert glass, even though it's actually in Egypt. There's a 2,500 square kilometer strewn field of vitrified rock. The classic geological dogma is this must be from some meteorite or asteroid that hit. No crater involved, no material that is definitively extraterrestrial. I'm convinced this is from major solar outbursts hitting plasma, hitting there. Another example is the Göbekli glass, which is also from the Egypt in the Western Desert in this case. This is a really good example. Can you see how it looks sort of bubbly and scoria-like? That's classic vitrified rock that we see. I've studied this on site, various places. This is a bit younger me. Can you recognize me? I'm not quite as gray there. Not at all, maybe. But this is what's known as the Moat of Mark in Scotland. And here I'm holding in my hand, again, some of the vitrified rock. Just as a side note, I don't know if you've ever heard any of the stories about King Arthur and that type of thing, and how they lived in glass castles. The Moat of Mark is actually a glass castle, quote unquote. What it is it goes back to the end of the last ice age. It was sort of a weird, crude fortification, piled up rock and whatnot, which apparently got hit by a plasma outburst and parts of it vitrified. And then these were often reused, including this particular case, in medieval times, in the so-called Dark Ages and early medieval times. So yeah, they were living in glass castles, but it wasn't like castles with stained glass window. Am I making sense? Yeah, it's interesting how it ties together. I want to just give you a little evidence. I don't want you to get bogged down in a lot of details here, but fulgurites, that is a fancy name of saying the rock that forms when a lightning hits the soil or hits another rock, hits sand, it forms fulgurites. It's a mineralogical, geological term, and there are people who study these. So in modern day, they chase big lightning bolts to see where it landed and collect the samples. And when they do that, and this is the work in this case of Michael Joseph, they have found that it has specific characteristics. And I want to quote this. He writes, several glasses of unknown origin have been referenced recently as meteorite impact or meteorite burst induced, including the Göbekli glass I just showed you pictures of. He mentions that specifically. And then he says, putative impact glass characteristics are all observed within the 11 fulgurite samples examined in this study, and suggest that Göbekli and other desert glasses of unknown origins need to be reevaluated. That's a fancy way of saying what I'm saying, that these are not necessarily impact structures or impact features or evidence of impactors, but could be plasma outbursts. Another example in geophysical research letters, generation of shock lamellae and melting rocks by lightning-induced shock waves and electrical heating. Says it all right there, in my opinion, as a geologist, that a lot of these features that people think were impactors are as easily, if not more easily and readily explained as intense plasma phenomena. Going to Egypt, I talked about the Sphinx at length yesterday during my lecture here at Snippy. Today I want to mention that even the Sphinx has literally a history of being struck by lightning, or we would now use the term plasma. So when you go to Egypt, if you come, I always like to show this to people. We go over to what's known as the Isis Temple, right on the Giza Plateau. And at the Temple of Isis, this stela, do you see it? The inset there is now in one of the museums in Cairo. It describes how the Sphinx was hit by a thunderbolt. And it's known as the inventory stela because it also includes an inventory of artifacts or of sacred objects that were in the temple of Isis. But it describes being hit by a thunderbolt. The great late Salim Hassan, who was one of the great Egyptian Egyptologists, he studied the Sphinx directly. He studied the inventory stela, and he talked about, you don't need to read all this, I'm going to summarize it right now. He's talked about how, if you could believe its inscriptions, we should have to credit Khufu. Now, Khufu is the supposed builder of the Great Pyramid before the Sphinx supposedly even existed. But according to this, Khufu repaired the Sphinx apparently after it was hit by a thunderbolt. And he even says, well, there may be a grain of truth to this because he could see the breakage on the Sphinx and that maybe Khufu was repairing something, or at least someone was repairing something. If there's even a, quote, grain of truth to this, it really upsets the Egyptological apple cart as to how old the Sphinx is. But you know that I believe the Sphinx goes back to the end of the last ice age, so it well could be that this was the case. Salim Hassan says, therefore, it is perhaps likely that the Sphinx was struck by lightning, but there's not a particle of evidence to show that this accident happened in the reign of Khufu. He thought it was later. I say, I agree with him. It's not the reign of Khufu, but it's much earlier. And so it does make sense that Khufu was going there to look at and repair it. Look at this old photograph of the Sphinx because it's been modified since with cement and, quote, repair. Do you see how towards the rump there's a fissure? And do you see that there? Toward the rump, that may in part have been opened up by a plasma strike. That's one working hypothesis. But do we have actual evidence of plasma strikes on the Giza Plateau? Answer is, I'm convinced, yes, because we have vitrification on the plateau. This was pointed out to me initially by Yosef Ayan and Mohammed Ibrahim, and they showed this to me, and I look at it, and this seems to be vitrified rock, which would indicate plasma strike on the Giza Plateau. Here, this is near the so-called mortuary temple of Khafra. And again, you see sort of under me and to the left, that is plasma. That is a plasma, or evidence of a plasma strike, vitrified rock. Here we have it again. And I am convinced at this point that, yes, the Giza Plateau itself, including a pre-existing Sphinx, was probably hit by a major plasma strike during a major solar outburst at the end of the last ice age. Now, were there pyramids there? I'm not convinced of that. In fact, I think that the pyramids, there may have been proto-pyramids or proto-structures there. I'll just hypothesize that at the moment. But something that Katie pointed out, my wife, Catherine Ulysses, pointed out, who is so instrumental with helping me with the research, she pointed out on one of our recent trips to Egypt that there seemed to be Lichtenberg patterns. Now, what are Lichtenberg patterns? They are dendritic patterns that spread out when a strong electrical discharge hits the certain surfaces. You can see this to this day. If you do strong electrical discharges in the laboratory to a flat surface or a vertical surface even, it forms these dendritic patterns. And we seem to find these on the Giza Plateau. Now, I would have expected them to be filled, or would have liked to have seen them filled with vitrified rock. But if you've ever been to Egypt, you know that the Giza Plateau, people are stomping all over it, and camels are walking all over it, and horses and donkeys and everything else. And any remains of vitrified rock, they wouldn't really survive that very readily. And a lot of people say, oh, they're water channels. Yeah, that's because you get so much water in the Giza Plateau on the edge of the Sahara. I'm being sarcastic. But they seem to emanate out of, as far as we can determine so far, the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid. So maybe there were plasma strikes here. Literally, the sun touched the the plateau, and the sun was God. I'll take questions at the end. Hold it, please. Otherwise, I'll get so distracted I'll never get through. Maybe the sun was literally touching the Giza plateau, and this made it a sacred site on top of, probably, potential geomagnetic anomalies, etc., that can be caused by such things. Because we see this elsewhere, for instance, at Calais or Callanish in Scotland, where they built megaliths on a site that was hit by, quote, lightning. Now, when I use the term lightning, I'm going to include both outbursts from the sun and atmospheric lightning, but most, so well beyond atmospheric lightning. So we have evidence of ice cores and isotopes and sediment cores and moon data and ancient vitrification for something happening at the very end of the last ice age, which I am convinced all the evidence points to solar outbursts. We have another line of evidence, and that is from the archaeological record, and I want to emphasize this at the moment, and that is ancient petroglyphs. And I have in the fine print there, I'm just pointing out that all the evidence that has been used to support comets can equally support solar outbursts. I've tried to show you a little bit of that right now, including craters. When even modern atmospheric lightning hits surfaces, for instance, a good lightning bolt hitting a parking lot, I don't know if you've ever seen that or seen pictures of it. It can form huge craters. When I say huge, from a human point of view, 20 feet, 30 feet across, that type of thing. Think what a plasma outburst from the sun could cause. So this brings me to the work of Dr. Anthony Perrott, who was a plasma physicist, and I say was, he's still alive, but he's retired. I've been in contact with him. I first met him, maybe close to 25 years ago now, but at that time I wasn't thinking about plasma in relationship to the end of the last ice age. He worked for many years at Los Alamos National Laboratory, famous for developing, among other things, the what? Come on. Atomic bomb, yeah, which, plasma came off the atomic bombs or atomic detonation, so it ties in with that type of work. And what he found with incredible work and incredible expense, and he's described this as he'd run these experiments with really high energy plasma discharges, and he's talked about how they'd have to do it, and they'd have to protect themselves with lead and all this stuff, and then they'd have to be a mile or more away when they actually ran the experiment because so much radiation comes off of them, and they're so dangerous and so expensive to run one test, one lab. But what they found is that plasma at these high intensities, as you would get in nuclear reactions, including not just atomic bombs, but things like the sun and stars, and what happened when the plasma discharges hit the atmosphere, it takes on very diagnostic shapes. And one of the most famous is what some people now call Squatter Man, but these are his graphics of it, and what they've been able to model and what they've done experimentally. It sort of looks like a stick figure. Do you see that it looks like a stick figure man? And I'm not being sexist here, but it is a man, not a woman, in a way, if you get what I mean. And it has little dots on its side, though, little donuts on its side. Real people don't have donuts on the side like that. That's what's known as synchrotron radiation coming off of it. And he found these in the lab. He modeled these in the lab. And you see them sometimes under the right conditions of the atmosphere when you have certain plasma configurations. But we haven't seen anything intense enough to really see them definitively. But can you see, especially on the right side, how it's starting to look like a figure with its arms in the air? So think about something like that. And he was modeling these, and he found that there's actually a number of very diagnostic and particular shapes. I'm just mentioning a few of them. One is figures with dots on their sides, these sort of stick figure men. Some are stick figure men with birds' heads, the heads of birds, what look like bird symbols on their heads. Some of them are cascading sort of donut shapes or toroid shapes. Actually, some of them, I don't show it here, look like owls with big eyes, pairs of big eyes. And you would have seen these in the sky. And these are some of his conceptual, some of his actual experimental data to show you. And he and his team became incredibly fascinated because the way he describes this, he's doing these in the lab. This is actually at the time top secret, very expensive experiments. And he goes out to New Mexico desert for relaxation. And what do they have there? They have petroglyphs. And he all of a sudden is startled to find that petroglyphs record the same shapes that they're spending millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars on in the lab to form these plasma configurations. Yet there they are on the rocks. And he became so fascinated by this that he and his team went to over 130 countries looking at petroglyphs. And this is samples from him of it. And you get these weird stick figure petroglyphs. What are petroglyphs? They're engravings on rock. So these go back to the end of the last ice age. That's my dating, not his dating. And they show systematically the same thing, including these weird dots on the side, which is very definitive. Real people don't have that. I don't know of any good explanation other than that they were commonly seen. They were all seen together. That's what I mean by commonality. What was seen in the sky, and they were recording it, which would have been very scary, very life-altering for them. And they were recording it around the world. I don't think everyone was just hallucinating stick figure people with dots on their side. And not only the stick figure people, but the bird-headed starts to see, sometimes you get these cup shapes, which then turn into what look like bird heads, etc. Again, this is from his work, Dr. Peratt's work. Here we have some more from they're just around the world, literally. This one I think is very important. If you look at this, because it starts to show, do you see how it really looks like a bird-headed, or bird on a body? And of course, artistically, and I'll show you pictures later, this becomes, as artistic renditions, more and more like a human body with a bird head. Think of Egypt even. And I'll show you some pictures of that later. But you get these, and I'm convinced, he's convinced, this indicates a major solar outburst, or solar outbursts, plural. These are some from Norway. These happen to be our own photos. Katie and I went to Norway, actually with the late John Anthony West, to give a series of lectures. I went on condition that we could go see some of the end of the last ice age petroglyphs, which we did, and they show the same pattern. Katie and I love Easter Island. We were married there, and we've been there a number of times now. And it also is part of this story, because not only do you have the big heads and moais, etc., but it ties in with the end of the last ice age. Just as a side note, if you're not familiar with Easter Island, it's a really remote area in the Pacific, sometimes considered one of the most remote, if maybe the most remote inhabited place on Earth, which could be important because it may be because of its remoteness that carried on traditions and for a very long time that were absorbed or, disintegrated. I don't know what term to use, compromised later. But it's known, of course, for the moai, these big heads and torsos, which are absolutely wonderful. It also has the birdman, so birdman petroglyphs. Can you see the birdman there? Okay, if you can't see them so well, this is a photograph from the early 1900s. It's actually the same site, or part of the same site, but they chalked them in to show them. They don't do that anymore because it's not good for the rocks. And as I mentioned, Katie and I were actually married on Easter Island. The middle photograph in the bottom there, if you wonder, that's the day we were married, but we're looking right into the sun. I mean, the sun is so harsh. So, Don't read anything into our expressions. But something besides the moai and the birdman petroglyphs, which are incredibly important to themselves for this story, is the rongo. Easter Island preserves one of the few independent, a lot of people argue, and I would argue, it's an independent, we'll call it loosely, script from Easter Island, indigenous to Easter Island, is connected, among other things, to the Birdman cult, and it's generally been considered one of the great mysteries of linguistics because it was never deciphered, and people have tried to decipher it ever since it was just, quote, discovered or became known to Westerners in the 1860s. And I'm very proud to say that Katie observed, literally shortly after we first went to Easter Island and were married there in 2010, we're looking at Dr. Peratt's petroglyphs, especially as seen in a video that David Talbot did about Symbols of the Alien Sky, it's called, but Katie's right there. Symbols of the Alien Sky, but basically his theories about antiquity and what was happening in the sky, which I don't agree with everything he suggests. In fact, I don't agree with a lot of what he suggests, although I like him very much as a person. But he, among other things, talked about Dr. Peratt's work, and she put together that, some of those petroglyphs and some of those configurations, plasma configurations, sure look a lot like the rongo glyphs. In fact, could the rongo be essentially a record of what happens in the sky during a major solar outburst? Everyone with me? And they are carved on wooden tablets. No, those wooden tablets are not 12,000 or close to 12,000 years old from then the last ice age. They are copies of copies of copies, just like I'm a great lover of classical texts like Plato, Aristotle, etc. How many manuscripts we have in Plato's hand? 0. Yeah, in fact, a lot of Plato's work is only known from manuscripts, the oldest of which are like 1,000 years or more after Plato. But we don't doubt that they're real and genuine, more or less recording what he wrote. Same here. These are copies of copies of copies, which the Rapa Nui, the Easter Island, will tell you. And when you compare them to the rongo glyphs to the petroglyphs, to the plasma configurations as modeled and as demonstrated experimentally by Dr. Peratt, they all line up and they all seem to go together. We published this, and a member, I think I put that here, a member of Dr. Peratt's team, he contacted us and he said very explicitly, Katie is correct. And they had discovered this independently before us, but they had purposefully not published it, but they had been using the rongo to study stellar dynamics and what would happen during major solar outbursts, which is really nice confirmation. Incidentally, the rongo glyphs, they sort of look, the Nazca geoglyphs? Very similar there, and we wonder, in fact, some cases those are modeled on what's happening during a solar outburst, or wild hypothesis, some of these plasma configurations could have been seen in the sky and actually imprinted their structure on the desert sand. And yes, they've now been venerated, they've been reworked, they've been, just like in, I don't know if you realize, in Australia, the Aboriginal paintings, cave paintings and that type of thing, some of my academic colleagues have gone and they say, oh, well, this is very modern. You can see this was done just in the last 100 years or 200 years. What they forget is that these things get painted over and over and over again. And if you look at all the layers on a microscopic level, they go back thousands of years, but they're still actively being, quote, renewed and reused. We see that so much with in the ancient world, and other things here. The bird or the birdman appearing elsewhere in Turkey, Easter Island compared to Göbekli Tepe in the upper right there. I just throw this out to be tantalizing, or the position of the hands on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe compared to the moai, or I find this fascinating, Urfam on the right, little basalt moai on the left. It's in the museum now on Easter Island, and I see some similarities between them. Or looking at one of the pillars, sometimes known as the vulture pillar, and these things on the top, people say they're baskets or purses or some kind of houses. Could they actually be some kind of indication of solar arcing? Because I think a lot of these symbols and whatnot that we see in the ancient world actually go back, whether they're actually dated in some cases to the end of the last ice age, or if they're recollections or symbols that were inspired by what happened at the end of the last ice age. I still think that we can hypothesize, I hypothesize that they go back to what was happening catastrophically at the end of the last ice age. Even things like do people recognize this? H-pillars from Pumapunka? Or look at this. This is, to me, fascinating. You've got Göbekli Tepe on the left. You've got Australian on the right. Do you see the similarity? I mean, what is going on there? And I just want to point out that that is from, I've got the book at home, that's from Churchward, Albert Churchward. There's another Churchward too that you may have heard of. That's from 1922, long before Göbekli Tepe was discovered. It's not like they were reading some modern article on Göbekli Tepe and decided to put it on their chest. So all kinds of fascinating correlations. I mentioned the pyramid text. Remember I mentioned the pyramid text yesterday and the concept of Zep Tepe? Well, if you look at the pyramid text in the pyramid of Unos, at Saqqara, I don't know if you can see it there, but a lot of the symbols, a lot of the motifs on the associated with the actual pyramid texts that talk about Zep Tepe, earlier cycle of civilization, they sure look like plasma configurations. And that's what we're comparing here. Some of the plasma configurations on the right, as demonstrated by Dr. Peratt, and on the left, a photograph we took in the pyramid of Unas. The Easter Islanders themselves have talked about what I think is their description of a plasma event. So this is a legend that was recorded back in 1963, long before anyone was thinking about these things. In the days of Roko Hitau, he was a legendary king of Easter Island, or chief. The sky fell from above onto the earth. The people cried out, the sky has fallen in the days of King Roko Hitau. He took hold. He waited a given time. The sky returned. It went away and it stayed up there. I think this could be a poetic version of what's happening during a plasma strike, and you see things in the sky, then it clears up again. Actually, it would come back and forth, as I'll show you in a few minutes. And one of the traditional names for Easter Island is Matatakitirani, which basically means eyes looking up at the sky. When the Rongo tablets were first found, or first became known to Westerners, they were all trying to translate them, the Westerners. And they kept asking the Easter Islanders, what do these mean? What do these mean? And they basically indicate, well, they can't really read them, but they have something to do with the sky. They literally indicated that. So are these guys looking up at the sky at configurations, at plasma configurations? So this is one of Dr. Peratt's papers with one of his colleagues. And he talks about evidence for intense solar outburst in prehistory. I am convinced, as a geologist dating the evidence, this goes back to the end of the last ice age, 9700 BCE. Paul Laviolette unfortunately died not that long ago. I knew him well. He was a colleague. He also talked about this. He was a physicist who looked at a lot of sediment cores and isotope data, came to the same conclusion. And I want to point out, since I've been talking about this, I'm not asking for or claiming any credit for inspiring this, but since 2010 to 2012, when I first began talking about this, A lot of work has since been done, and I'm just showing you some headlines. Don't need to try to read them, but they're all 2012, 2017. I'm looking at here, 2018, 2019, etc., more or less post 2012 or so, when I published the first edition of Forgotten Civilization and talked about, the subtitle was The Role of Solar Outbursts in Our Past and Future. So you get the point there. A lot of work has now been done that since the end of the last ice age, we have evidence that the sun has been very unstable. And there's something, I'll point out one, 774, 775 of the Common Era AD. So 8th century AD, Charlemagne. You've heard of Charlemagne? Yeah, the Holy Roman Emperor, I guess you could call him, or whatever. During his lifetime, there was a major solar outburst, nothing close to what happened at the end of the last ice age. But if it happened today, would we be here? Well, our civilization would basically be decimated because it would knock out electrical grid systems, satellite communications. It would fry all the electronics from associated solar proton or solar particle event. There would be an EMP, electromagnetic pulse associated with it, etc. So I'm convinced that the end of the last ice age was brought about by a major solar outburst. I've just tried to give you a little bit of the evidence. I mentioned the Younger Dryas. I won't give you a quiz because you're not in my class at Boston University, but the Younger Dryas ends in 9700 BCE. Remember, it's a cooling period. The last phase of the last ice age, when does it begin? 10,900 BCE. I contend that's a solar outburst that begins the Younger Dryas as well as ends the Younger Dryas. Many people think very logically, oh yes, a major solar outburst, the sun, plasma, that's going to heat up the earth. That seems very logical. It seems illogical to them that the sun could cool the earth. But I contend if you have the correct conditions, that's exactly what will happen. There's evidence of a massive solar outburst. This is Paul Le Violette again, to give him credit where credit is due. He also came to the conclusion, based on isotope data, that roughly 12,000 years ago, he dated, I forget what his date was. Oh yeah, there's his date. He says 12,837 plus or minus 10 calendar years BP. Basically, when you convert that, and BP is before 1950, technically. Anyway, when you start looking at the data, it's incredibly close to 9700 BCE, put it that way. So he also contends there's a major solar outburst at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. So how can that cause a cooling effect? What you have, if you remember at the beginning, I talked about how just before the Younger Dryas, climate was doing what? It was getting warmer. There were huge continental glaciers. As the climate got warmer, ice in the middle of these glaciers did what? It melted. It formed huge lakes on top of the glaciers, which were blocked by ice dams. You get the picture? And what happened, and we now have data, very clear data, this was published in Nature Geoscience in 2018, that these ice dams broke catastrophically, dumped all the water into the oceans, caused major changes in circulation patterns, and caused a cooling effect, primarily in the Northern Hemisphere. And the Younger Dryas is seen primarily in the Northern Hemisphere for 1,200 years before the next major solar outburst. So the first solar outburst in 10,900 BCE, yes, it's warm, it's plasma, in that sense. It's electrical discharges, but what does it do? It breaks those ice dams. Am I making sense? So yes, it's breaking the ice dams, it's dumping the water, it's causing the ocean circulation patterns to change, and it's causing the cooling effect. Not unlike, I'm not into Hollywood movies, but there was a movie, The Day After Tomorrow, which talked about a sudden cooling effect. may have well happened like that. Now, I mean, I don't think based on the geological evidence in a day and night for the cooling effect at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, but relatively sudden geologically. So we have evidence that suggests that there's a cataclysmic events mark both the beginning, the end of the Younger Dryas, and the end of the last ice age, specifically solar events. And there's this period when Göbekli Tepe people, the originators of what we now call the Sphinx, so whatever they called themselves, I don't know, but they were in Egypt, so they're Egyptians in that sense. Their civilizations and other civilizations at that time that may have existed, and we have some evidence of that, but I can't get into all of that in such a short lecture. They were decimated at 9700 BC. It basically threw humanity into what we would call a dark age. Everyone's familiar with the dark age? That begins in the 5th century AD in the West with the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, think of something like that, but on a much more massive scale and globally. And it was caused by what? The sun. So Katie and I call it the Solar-Induced Dark Age, or SIDA for short, SIDA, Solar-Induced Dark Age. And that lasts for about 6,000 years before civilization reemerges again. And just remember, a major solar outburst is going to have all kinds of effects. The sudden melting of glaciers, I've talked about these already, the deluges, the biblical style floods, etc. Depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer, and it's going to cause high radiation levels, very high radiation levels on the surface of Earth. I'll come to that in a few minutes, which can cause extinctions, among other things. You're going to have major forest fires where it hits forests and sets them on fire. You're going to get, quote, black mats, where you have the ash of the forest fires. You're going to have oceanic and atmospheric circulation changes. You're going to have literal incineration, just all these things we've talked about. And if it happens today or tomorrow or next year or in our lifetime, is it going to devastate our society? Yes, but I don't want to go there right now. How do you survive it? Well, let's talk about something positive. How do you survive it? Basically, the best way is to go underground, absolutely underground. I've talked to a number of physicists about this to protect yourself from the radiation on the surface levels, the plasma discharges, etc. And we see around the world underground, I'll call them shelters, and I'll come back to that in 2 seconds. We see this around the globe. What could not go underground was large mammals. And we know that at the end of the last ice age, I'm trained in part as a paleontologist, there were major extinctions. And I want to be clear, there are major extinctions. And this is a paper by Faith and Survell, and this was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is really good, peer-reviewed work. And what they found, and other paleontologists, including myself, have found, is that these mass extinctions occurred at the end of the last ice age, literally about 9700 BCE. Not even at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, but at the end of it. And what you have are die-offs of the large mammals, the top of the food chain, those that could not escape. A lot of small animals could escape because they would go underground naturally. They would go into caves naturally. A few large animals, like cave bears and whatnot, will go into caves, but most of them don't survive it. And that's exactly what you see in the extinction record at that time. Are humans large animals? Yes. And in fact, Paul Laviolette, before he passed away, he calculated radiation levels would have been so high on the surface of the Earth in certain areas because of the plasma strikes and the depletion of the ozone layer, etc., that you could not survive by being continuously on the surface for more than 5 or 6 days. You would have to go and seek shelter. You could come out again because the plasma strikes would sort of be like an earthquake. I'm a geologist. So when you have a major earthquake, you have the major earthquake, very destructive, but you also have what? aftershocks. So there would have been smaller aftershocks. And you see this in the isotope record that I'll show you in a minute. And a lot of archaeologists have been very puzzled by this. So this is the work of, let me make sure I get it right. Heinrich Kusch with his wife Ingrid. And they're Austrian, and they've been puzzled by how there are all these underground tunnels at the end of the last ice age. Why would you do this? Well, when you put it together with what I'm talking about, this is how you could survive. And we see this around the world. And I want to point out that some of these I'm showing you are not necessarily end of last ice age, but if your ancestors went through this, might you be preparing if it happens again? Just like building a fallout shelter in case there's a nuclear war. So on Easter Island, you have these so-called houses or artificial caves, which would be great for protecting yourself from a solar outburst, not so great to protect yourself from your enemies, because they'll just say, oh, you're in there and we're not going to let you out and you can starve to death. And also there's a tradition on Easter Island when times get bad of going underground into caves, and these were inhabited. This is well known. I'm just going to flip through these quickly, and there's me emerging from one of the blocked up entrances. They would block them up to just so there's the smallest passage. You have this around the world. I think some of these barrows, these, for instance, are in England, were for that purpose. Or here's Mesa Verde. Why under the cliff? Well, many reasons, but one of them could be, I would say, just solar outbursts. On Malta, you get this. We went to Malta, and we were looking at the cart ruts and other things I could talk about another time, but they have these underground caves where people were living. And you have Ajanta in India. And yes, these are used later by the Buddhist monks, et cetera, et cetera. I think many of these were reused and modified, but when did they originate and why did they originate? I think that their origins and the concept goes back to the end of the last ice age. There's Ellora in India, which is just incredible if you haven't been there, carved out of the bedrock. Why? I think it goes back to this earlier concept. And Gunung Padang, have you heard about that in Indonesia? Had the opportunity to visit that some years ago. And this is from Danny Hillman Natuwajaja. I just saw him at Cosmic Summit, a wonderful person and a very well-respected geophysicist and seismologist. And he's been working on this site. And guess what? You have structures, probably natural, admittedly, but a cavity within Gunung Padang, which, based on his core drilling and radiometric dating, there was a passage to it that was sealed up when essentially precisely at the end of the last ice age, which I think is very telling. I just throw this out to think about. And then quintessential examples of this are in Cappadocia in Turkey. Everyone knows the underground cities or has heard of the underground cities there. Really fabulous to see. They have this long, you can take a balloon over it, which is really incredible. And you can see how they've been carving into the rock. They have a long tradition of carving into the rock, but they have various cities that there's hundreds of them actually, been recorded, but several of them are open to the public to view. In this case, we're looking at Kamakali. Another one is during Kuyu, and you can go into it. And numerous stories deep. This one is 8 or more stories deep with wonderful ventilation, just really precisely carved. Why do you go through all this? And I think it has to do with what happened at the end of the last ice age, that at least the origins of this tradition go back to that time. I don't buy the arguments that many of my academic colleagues make that was to escape from enemies. When you have a underground city that can hold literally thousands of people and livestock, etc., and is numerous stories deep, 8 to 16 or stories deep, you've got a lot of debris when you're carving that out. You're going to have huge piles of spoils, debris. It's going to sit right there. It's going to tell your enemies exactly where you are. They just, cover over the ventilation shafts and entrances and let you starve to death. No. And we don't have those spoil heaps. Why not? Because I think these go back to a much earlier period. They have eroded away since. Yes, is there evidence that they were used just a few thousand years ago? Absolutely. That doesn't mean they originated then. You get my point? People still live, especially in Europe, in houses that are hundreds of years old. They still build over or use foundations that are thousands of years old. So there, oh yeah, here's Darien Kuyu, a little diagram of it, and it's just incredible to go through these sites and see them for yourself. And civilization reemerges around 4000 BCE in various regions. One place is in Turkey, and I think that it's significant and important. When you go back to modern Turkey, of course, that's where Göbekli Tepe is. We talked about that before. Cappadocia region, and independent of any work of mine, and I like independent confirmation or corroboration, work has been done mapping the origins of the Indo-European language family. So you can basically do a family tree of the languages. I'm sure you've all heard of this or are familiar with something like this. And when this has been done, and this is one of many studies, this was published in Science in 2012, they traced back the origins of the Indo-European language families, and look at this. They traced the area back to Cappadocia region. And when you start analyzing it, the various languages and language families and their timeline, etc., and this is a crude timeline, it basically traces it back to the end of the last ice age, which would be independent, in my opinion, confirmation that, yes, a population survived there and then spread out again. I want to point out that we have a number of archaeological sites post-Ice Age, but before 4000 to 3000 BCE, they are all very, very similar. I'm not cherry picking here. I just want to show you one. This is Çatalhöyük in Turkey also. It spans several millennia, but even the oldest portions are a couple of thousand years younger than Göbekli Tepe. And if they're younger, it should be, by this traditional view, what? More or less advanced? More, much more advanced. But it's not. It's the opposite, because I contend we're talking about the solar-induced dark age. They go into a dark age, and here what they have is not monumental stonework, but mud brick. The technology associated with it is much more primitive, if you would. It's civilization decline, civilization hanging on, if you even want to call it true civilization at that point. And, you know, I love the area and the people, and, you know, I have great respect for we'll call it the Çatalhöyük people, but they weren't what it was. They weren't at the level, from all the physical evidence, that their ancestors were thousands of years earlier. Here's sort of the height of their monumental sculpture. This is a mud brick wall with plaster and some painting on it. So this, I contend, is civilization in decline. So in the last 10 minutes here, because I have about 10 minutes left, I think, I want to talk about some implications of that. We have the solar-induced dark age from about 9,700 BCE to the period of, let's just say, 3,700 BCE, so about 6,000 years. And it happened back at the end of the last ice age. Could it happen again? Absolutely. I speak as a geologist. If it happened before, it's going to happen again. I mean, that's the way stars are. That's the way things work. Thomas Gold suggested it might be every 10,000 or so years back in the 1960s. If that's the case, are we a couple of millennia past due? Yep. And there have been work, this was in Nature, one of the premier journals, about how there's unusual activity of the sun during recent decades, more or less our lifetime, compared to the last 11,000 years. I don't want to scare you here. This is a diagram based on isotope proxies of solar activity end of the last ice age and since. And what you have is the sun was really, really active. See that in red? Then it gets really dormant, but then really active again. Do you see how it's sort of anthropomorphically agitated and undergoing fluctuations? This is what you don't want if you're going to be a technologically sophisticated, electronic-based civilization. So it's really active. This is the end of the last ice age. Slowly, we humanity go into a dark age. The early civilizations are decimated. Then it calms down. The sun calms down. This is 4000 BCE here. And calms down, and see how the sun is now relatively stable and calm, all things considered. If anything, it's low but not high. And that's when civilization begins to reemerge. This is our cycle of civilization. But what's happening at the end here? The sun is becoming very what? Active again. And we had better be warned about that. There was something known as the Carrington event in 1859 when there was a major couple coronal mass ejections that hit Earth. If they hit Earth today, back then there was only the telegraph system as far as sort of applications of electronics or electrical devices. It fried the telegraph systems. It set telegraph stations on fire, etc. If that happened today, it would, really decimate us. There have been a few close calls recently. I'm just listing a few here. May 1921, something occurred which would cause blackouts of millions of people today because some of the older technology 100 plus years ago was much more robust than it is today, but even that caused problems. A solar storm in 1989 caused Hydro-Quebec transmission lines to be disrupted and a blackout for 6 million people. In October 2003, you had one in Sweden and South Africa. Why Sweden and South Africa? Because they're closer to the poles. So that's where the plasma is coming in with a fairly minor solar event. 2012, we had one where there was a major discharge from the sun, but it was directed and we were in the wrong place in the orbit, or the right place, depending on how you view it, but the wrong place to be hit, the right place not to be hit. If that had hit, I think we might not actually be here today, personally, because it would have caused so much destruction. And that comes to another thing. Some solar outbursts are directed, so they come from just one part of the sun, but there's now more and more evidence that the sun, like other solar-style stars, can also undergo solar outbursts where it throws off a sheath of plasma and in some cases small impact or small particles that may fuse in space, but material in all directions. This is now being termed a micronova. If a micronova occurs, and there's evidence this has occurred with the sun based on evidence of solar-type stars, doesn't matter where we are in the orbit, we will be hit, unfortunately. And I just show you here, this is T Pixidus. This has a cycle on the order of decades for nova-like phenomena, micronova phenomena. There's other evidence that solar-type stars undergo outbursts, major outbursts like this, we'll call it micronovas, on the order of 10 to 15,000 years, 10 to 12,000 years or so. I personally think, based on the evidence, and I'm not absolute about this, but based on the evidence, our sun probably goes through a period of instability for a couple of millennia, then calms down for maybe 10,000 years or so, and then picks up again. And unfortunately, the picking up again, we may be seeing that right now in our lifetime. So what happened 12,000 years ago with at the end of the last ice age may be happening right now. Okay, couple of other things I need to cover, and I'll do this quickly because I am paying attention to the time. What could be causing this? It could be as we're going around the galaxy, we go up above and below the galactic equator. This may be disrupting us, especially if we have a solar companion, if we're part of a binary system. So it may be affecting the sun. It may be affecting us. This may be even indicated on things like ancient inscriptions, ancient iconography. What you see on the left and right is a basalt moai that's in the British Museum now. And if you look at the back of it, is it indicating that we may be going through something like this? Again, this is speculation, but I think it's important to speculate. That's where science starts, with speculation and hypotheses. So I've talked about the solar-induced dark age and how the sun is really our keystone to sea level rises, flooding, die-off of large mammals, underground cities, plasma petroglyphs, but solar worship. The ancients, and this is the last point I want to make with several slides, there's a message here, I think, from the sun. The sun is a spiritual, there's a spiritual message, I suspect, with the sun and its energies and what has been called sacred science. That the sun, yes, can be very destructive, but it's also life-giving. It has essentially a personality of its own. It may even be conscious. I actually take that very seriously now as a plasma configuration may be conscious. And that the birdman and the birdwoman in Egypt and elsewhere, these are all solar plasma symbols. They're symbols that convey a more profound message. And what we're looking at around the world with solar symbolism may be messages expressed. Sometimes Katie and I talk about science expressed in the language of art, that we have things going on here. So, for instance, in India, you have Garuda, this winged birdman that is the Mount of Vishnu, the sun, carrying the sun, driving the chariot of sun. We were in Cambodia actually earlier this month, and here is Garuda in a beautiful ancient sculpture. In India, they talk about how the sun is considered the physical manifestation of God, the one physical manifestation of God. And here's from India, we saw this: the right and true path leads to the formless one God, the sun. The ancient Egyptians believe that when we die, we can be reborn as stars in the sky. We can be reborn as the sun, which is a star. Here on a sarcophagus from ancient dynastic Egypt, you see the deceased becoming a star, going to the sun. Is this just silly nonsense, or is it something that we can take seriously? Are stars collections of consciousness at some level? Plasma, electromagnetic phenomena have consciousness. Here you see, this is actually from Tutankhamun, the deceased connected to stars, or the pharaohs going up to the sky as stars. And I want to leave on with a final few thoughts. Katie, this is when we first met in 2007, and she showed me or talked to me about hypothesis that she had that the ancient Egyptians believed when we die that we can be reborn as stars in the sky. And she suggested that this has something to do with the cycle of hydrogen, or I would now say the cycle of plasma, hydrogen in ionized form. And she suggested to me, and this got us discussing things, that she was inspired by a television show. She's not a scientist. She's trained as a ballet dancer. And that hydrogen, the sun is basically hydrogen. It's formed from hydrogen clouds in space that combine and compress gravitationally. And she hypothesized that when we die, our hydrogen is released from us, and being light, it floats upward to space where it gathers into hydrogen clouds and then collapses into stars or into suns, or our sun specifically. Now, this might sound crazy, but it turns out hydrogen is much more complex than most people imagine. They think of just simple proton, electron. Even a proton or electron is probably much more complex than most people imagine. And there is work, for instance, Luc Montagnier, the Nobel Prize winner, unfortunately now deceased, he did very controversial work about how water can carry information via electromagnetic imprints. I have looked at this. I'm convinced that he was onto something, that it's good work, but I think it's not so much just the water, but the hydrogen itself that can imprint and encode information. And that is the basis of intention and consciousness. Emoto, you've heard of work of Emoto along similar lines, somewhat similar lines, and water, and I would say the hydrogen and the protons in particular, responding to thought, we'll call it telepathy if you want. And this has been dismissed by many academic colleagues, but there have been studies that have confirmed it, have corroborated his work. So it's not, and I've looked at it carefully, it's not just nonsense. Or Cleve Baxter, maybe you've heard of him and his work with plants that respond. And what are plants? Mostly hydrogen. So when we physically die, according to this hypothesis, the hydrogen is constituent subatomic particles is released. Hydrogen carries information about us literally, and they become entangled. They may be, in fact, entangled at a quantum level, being within us during our lifetime, imprinted by us and associated closely with us. They can aggregate, they can collect, they can stay in communication, and diverse collections of hydrogen carrying different sets of information about us personally may be released from the physical body. And if the personality, the consciousness, and this is a basis of so many religions, survives after our physical death, maybe this is one manifestation of it. If it's to survive in a recognizable form, in the next life, it may be important and necessary to combine these elements, to get them back together, to have what I call the psychic components integrate with each other. And if you've followed any of the traditions, the sacred traditions, going back many millennia, many of them emphasize the self-inner work to keep these together as a whole. It also brings up, is matter and consciousness, if they're interlinked, which is fundamental? And I personally suspect that is ultimately information and consciousness. I want to point out that the ancient Egyptians, they had this concept, this is my term, soul components. The different aspects of the soul are the different psychic elements that have to be recombined if you're going to survive beyond this physical body. And then he's probably my favorite physicist, Max Planck, the founder of quantum mechanics and quantum theory, the 1918 Nobel Prize winner in physics. This is a real quote from him, because I always check quotes. I don't just buy things off the internet because there's so much misinformation, but I found the original source for this. He says, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as a derivative of consciousness. We cannot get derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. And I would say in our physical world, the most fundamental material expressions of consciousness are electrons and protons. That's what we see in our world. And what's beyond that? And that's basically hydrogen or plasma. And this brings us back to Katie's theory, and it also brings us to this statue, which I'm going to end on with just a few comments on it. This is the so-called statue of Khafra from Egypt, found in the Valley Temple, associated with the Sphinx. And I mentioned this statue yesterday in my presentation. But if you look at it, in light of plasma physics, modern plasma physics, it actually carries a message. Notice Dr. Perot's plasma configurations are actually carved into the statue. So we see the bird-headed man, or the bird man, when you look at the statue from the side. The lion chair, the lion is associated with the sun. We have the chair is being carried by cascading rings. Those are the plasma tori. You've got the plasma torus. You've got essentially an artistic version of a plasma configuration on the side. And this ancient statue, I contend, Katie and I have speculated or hypothesized or assert, is a symphony in stone, basically saying we become the sun, we become the stars, and the birdman's representing eternal life. And this is accepted by Egyptologists that Horus, the birdman, the falcon, is associated with the sun. That's the living sun, Ra-Horak-Hute. I can't say now, Hute. And Here's another one, just one couple more slides. Another example is Anubis, Lord of the Dead, standing over the deceased. And what do they lie on? A lion-headed bed, a lion bed, which is the sun, going up to the sun, the plasma. Or you look at this. Doesn't that look a bit like Dr. Perot's configurations, his research? I don't think that's just a cow palette. I think there's much more significance there, including the stars, including the dots, if you would, on the side. So basically, we have to accept, I believe, that the ancients knew what they were talking about. The ancients knew that we were connected to the sun and to the stars, that we are part of the cosmos, the larger cosmos, in a very literal sense. And we return to the divine. The divine is very real in terms of conscious, I'll call it conscious plasma at this point, the sun, the stars, etc. And we need to rediscover that, understand our cosmic origins, our cosmic connections. Certainly Plato talked about this and the whole concept of earlier cycles of civilization. The Yugas talk about this. The Maya talk about this. And bottom line is that we had an earlier civilization, an earlier cycle of civilization that was decimated at the end of the last ice age. So if you want to read more about this, I suggest my book, Forgotten Civilization. Please make sure you get the second revised edition, which is updated, has a new chapter, lots of new photos, additions to all the other chapters. My wife, wrote a beautiful children's book, which is the first in a series to introduce these concepts to a younger generation. The first one is about the mysteries of the Sphinx. It's named Adriana and the Ancient Mysteries. Adriana's the main character of the book, and she's exploring the Great Sphinx and the mysteries about the Great Sphinx. So Adriana and the Ancient Mysteries, the Great Sphinx. I do a lot of, Katie and I do a lot of work for the not-for-profit Organization for the Research of Ancient Cultures, or Oracle. We volunteer our time for that. And if you go to my website, you can find a link to Oracle, and there's a trailer for a documentary that Oracle has been working on for some years now. We can always use donations. These things get expensive. But civilization before civilization. If you'd like to see Easter Island for yourself or revisit if you've been there before, I'm doing a tour. I do my own research trips. I also do public tours. So to Easter Island, go to robertschoch.com for information on that. Go to the tours page and you'll see links. Or if you'd like to see Egypt, there is a total solar eclipse of longer than 6 minutes duration, more than 6 minutes of totality, viewable from Luxor in August 2027. And we're doing actually 2 versions of the tour there, centered on the solar eclipse, if you'd like to visit Easter Island with us. So that's it for now. And I probably run a little bit over time, and I apologize about that. So I don't know if there's time to take questions publicly, but I'm here and I'm happy to answer questions privately. So thank you very much. I really appreciate being here.